Good evening. My name is Cole, and tonight's stories are about those moments where everything could have ended differently by a matter of seconds, a single decision, or one uneasy feeling you couldn't explain. These are true near-miss encounters. When something went wrong, someone revealed their intentions, or fate shifted just enough for a life to be spared. So get comfortable, subscribe, dim the lights, and let's step into these chilling stories of people who came terrifyingly close to not making it out. Let's start with our first story. This one comes from someone who survived simply by asking the right question at exactly the wrong moment. I survived because I asked one question at the wrong time. Looking back, I can't believe how close I came to not being here to tell this story. It was a Tuesday night in November, and I'd been staying late at the library studying for finals. The campus was mostly empty, and my usual ride had already left hours earlier. I was resigned to walking the 2 miles home when my phone buzzed with a text from my cousin Derek, offering me a ride. Derek and I had always been close growing up. Our families lived just a few blocks apart, and we'd spent countless summers together. He was like an older brother to me, someone I trusted completely. So when he offered to pick me up, I didn't hesitate to say yes. I gathered my books and waited by the library entrance, grateful not to have to walk home alone in the dark. When Derek pulled up, something felt different about him, but I couldn't put my finger on what it was. He seemed more tense than usual, gripping the steering wheel tighter than necessary. But I was tired and stressed about my exams, so I chalked it up to my own exhaustion and climbed into the passenger seat. As we drove through the quiet streets, Derek kept glancing at me through the rearview mirror in a way that made me uncomfortable. Then he started asking questions. Strange questions. He wanted to know who knew where I was tonight. Had I told anyone he was picking me up? Did my phone have good service out here? Was my roommate expecting me back at a certain time? At first, I answered without thinking much about it. No, I hadn't told anyone about the ride. Yes, my phone had service. No, my roommate wasn't expecting me until later. But as the questions continued, something in my stomach started to twist. Derek's voice had taken on this odd, almost clinical tone that I'd never heard from him before. We'd been driving for about 10 minutes when I realized we weren't heading toward my apartment. We were taking back roads I didn't recognize, moving away from the campus and into an area I'd never been to before. The streetlights became fewer and farther between, and I could see empty fields stretching out on both sides of the road. That's when I asked the question that probably saved my life. I turned to Derek and said, "Why are we going this way? And why do you keep asking who knows where I am?" The change in his demeanor was immediate and terrifying. His hands tightened on the steering wheel until his knuckles went white. His jaw clenched, and when he looked at me, there was something in his eyes I'd never seen before. Something cold and calculating that made my blood run cold. He didn't answer my question. Instead, he just stared ahead at the dark road and pressed harder on the gas pedal. The car picked up speed, and I watched the speedometer climb past 60, then 70 miles per hour on these narrow country roads. My heart started pounding as I realized how isolated we were. There were no other cars, no houses with lights on, nothing but darkness stretching out in every direction. I kept my voice as calm as possible and asked Derek to slow down, to explain where we were going, but he just kept driving faster, his breathing getting heavier and more erratic. I started to panic. This was my cousin, someone I'd known my entire life, but the person sitting next to me felt like a complete stranger. I could feel the phone in my pocket, but I was afraid to reach for it. Something told me that any sudden movement might make whatever was happening worse. We drove for another few minutes in this horrible tension before Derek suddenly pulled over onto a dirt road that led into what looked like a wooded area. He put the car in park but left the engine running. The headlights illuminated a narrow path that disappeared into the trees. I knew with absolute certainty that if I got out of that car, I would never make it home. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to run, but we were in the middle of nowhere, and Derek was bigger and stronger than me. I had to think fast. I told Derek I was feeling sick and needed to throw up. I opened the passenger door and pretended to lean out, but instead of getting sick, I rolled out of the car and started running as fast as I could back toward the main road. I heard Derek shouting behind me, but I didn't look back. I just kept running until I reached the paved road, where I flagged down the first car I saw. The driver was an elderly man who immediately knew something was wrong. He let me use his phone to call 911, and when the police arrived, Derek was gone. They found his car abandoned on that dirt road, but he was nowhere to be found. It took months before I learned the full truth. Derek had been planning this for weeks. The police found messages on his phone detailing how he was going to get me alone, how he was going to make sure no one would know where I was. They found maps of that wooded area, tools in his trunk, and a timeline that showed this wasn't some spontaneous decision. Months later, I was sitting in a courthouse listening to a prosecutor read those messages aloud to a jury. The details of what Derek had planned to do to me that night were so horrific that I had to leave the room several times. The prosecutor said that if I hadn't asked that question when I did, if I hadn't trusted my instincts and run when I had the chance, I wouldn't be alive to testify. Derek was charged with attempted murder, kidnapping, and a dozen other charges. He was sentenced to 25 years in prison. During his sentencing, he looked right at me and mouthed the words, "I'm sorry." But there was still something cold in his eyes that made me grateful for the security guards standing between us. The thing that still haunts me is how normal everything seemed at first. This was someone I trusted completely, someone I'd grown up with. If it hadn't been for that one question at exactly the right moment, I would have become another statistic, another missing person whose family never got answers. That single question saved my life because it forced Derek to reveal his true intentions. In that moment, when his mask slipped and I saw what he really was, I knew I had to run. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd just stayed quiet, if I'd been too polite or too trusting to question why we were taking that route. I don't like to think about it too much. The most terrifying thing about survival is realizing how thin the line is between safety and danger. One question, asked at the wrong time, saved my life. If I'd waited even a few more minutes to speak up, I might not be here to tell this story. That story absolutely chills me to the bone, because it shows how the people closest to us can sometimes be the most dangerous. The poster's intuition and that single brave question literally saved their life. It's horrifying to think about how calculated and premeditated the whole thing was, spanning weeks of planning. The fact that this was family makes it even more disturbing. Trust your gut, always. If something feels wrong, it probably is. Let's move to our next story, where a routine elevator ride turned into a terrifying brush with death in just seconds. I was just riding the elevator, like any other day, when everything went wrong in a matter of seconds. I work on the 15th floor of an office building downtown, and I'd taken that same elevator hundreds of times without ever thinking twice about it. It was one of those older buildings from the 70s, but everything seemed well maintained. The elevators were inspected regularly, and I'd never heard of any problems. That morning started like any other. I was running a few minutes late for a meeting, so when the elevator doors opened on the ground floor, I quickly stepped inside and hit the button for 15. There were two other people with me, a woman from accounting and a man I didn't recognize, probably visiting one of the other companies in the building. We were somewhere around the 8th floor when I heard this sound. It wasn't loud, just a subtle grinding noise that lasted maybe 2 seconds. The woman from accounting looked up at the ceiling with a slight frown, but none of us said anything. Old buildings make weird noises all the time, right? Then it happened. The elevator just dropped. I've never experienced anything like that feeling of weightlessness. 1 second, we were rising normally, and the next second, my stomach was in my throat and my feet weren't touching the ground. The fluorescent lights above us flickered, and I could hear this horrible screeching sound of metal against metal. The fall felt like it lasted forever, but it probably only took a few seconds. We dropped 2 full floors before the emergency brakes kicked in. When they did, the impact was devastating. I slammed into the floor so hard that I bit through my tongue and felt something in my shoulder pop. The woman next to me screamed as she hit the wall. The man was thrown against the control panel. The elevator shuddered to a stop between the 6th and 7th floors. And for a moment, everything was silent except for the sound of our breathing. The lights had gone out completely, and we were trapped in total darkness. I could taste blood in my mouth, and my shoulder was throbbing with pain. The woman was crying softly, and I could hear the man trying to feel around for his phone to use as a flashlight. I was too shocked to move for the first few minutes. I just sat there on the floor of the elevator, trying to process what had just happened. When the man finally got his phone light working, I could see that we were all banged up but alive. The woman had a cut on her forehead from hitting the wall. The man's nose was bleeding. My shoulder was definitely dislocated or worse, but I could move my fingers, which seemed like a good sign. We tried pressing the emergency button, but nothing happened. The man had cell service though, so he called 911. Within about 20 minutes, we could hear voices from outside the elevator shaft. The fire department was working to get us out. It took them almost 2 hours to extract us safely. They had to manually open the doors on the 7th floor and lower a ladder down to where we were stuck. By the time they got me to the hospital, my shoulder was so swollen that they had to cut my shirt off. The real shock came the next day when I was contacted by building management. They wanted to interview me about what happened, And that's when I learned the terrifying truth about how close we'd come to dying. The elevator technician explained that the main support cables had been gradually wearing down over several months. There had been small signs of stress that should have been caught during routine inspections, but somehow they'd been missed. The cables finally gave way that morning, but the emergency braking system engaged just in time to prevent a complete freefall. But here's the part that still gives me nightmares. The technician told me that if we'd been in that elevator just 1 minute longer, the emergency brakes wouldn't have worked either. The system was designed to catch a falling elevator, but only if the main cables failed within a certain time frame. After that, the emergency system itself would have been compromised by the stress. He showed me the maintenance logs and pointed to timestamps that proved we'd entered the elevator at exactly 9:47 a.m. The cables snapped at 9:49 a.m. If we'd gotten on just 60 seconds later, or if the elevator had been moving slower that morning, we would have experienced a complete system failure. A free fall from the 8th floor would have killed all of us instantly. The elevator car would have hit the basement at over 60 miles per hour. The technician said there wouldn't have been anything left to recover. What haunts me most is how random it all was. If I hadn't been running late that morning, I might have taken an earlier elevator. If the woman from accounting had stopped to chat with someone in the lobby, she might have missed that ride entirely. If the visiting man had decided to take the stairs instead, he'd be alive and I'd be dead. The building was shut down for 3 weeks while they replaced the entire elevator system. I learned later that the company responsible for maintenance had been cutting corners for years, skipping detailed inspections to save money. Several people were fired and there were lawsuits, but that didn't change the fact that 3 people almost died because someone decided to save a few $1,000s on proper maintenance. I still take elevators, but I'm much more aware of every sound they make. Sometimes I'll hear a slight grinding or feel a small jolt, and my heart rate spikes immediately. Most of the time it's nothing, just normal building settling and minor mechanical adjustments, but I know how quickly normal can become deadly. The woman from accounting and I still work in the same building, though it's been completely renovated now. We nod to each other when we pass in the hallways, but we've never talked about what happened that day. I think we both prefer to pretend it was just a bad dream. But sometimes, when I'm lying in bed at night, I think about those 60 seconds that saved my life. 1 minute earlier or later, and I wouldn't be here to worry about elevator sounds or shoulder pain or anything else. It's a humbling reminder of how fragile everything really is. That story perfectly captures how quickly a routine moment can turn into a life or death situation. The fact that they missed death by literally 60 seconds is absolutely terrifying. It also shows how corporate negligence can put innocent people at risk every single day. The randomness of survival timing is what makes these near-death experiences so haunting. You never know when a regular Tuesday morning elevator ride might be your last. I can't imagine ever feeling completely safe in an elevator again after something like that. Our next story takes us to what should have been a peaceful day at the lake, where calm waters hid a deadly trap beneath the surface. I almost drowned in a place where everyone said the water was perfectly safe. This wasn't some remote wilderness location or a beach with dangerous riptides. It was Mirror Lake, a popular swimming spot about an hour from my college campus. The water was crystal clear, the depth was well marked, and there were always plenty of people around. It seemed like the safest place in the world to cool off on a hot summer day. I've been going to Mirror Lake since I was a kid. My family had a tradition of spending at least one weekend there every summer, and I'd probably swum in those waters 100 times without ever having a problem. The lake was spring-fed, so the water stayed cool even in August, and the bottom was mostly sandy with some scattered rocks. Perfect for swimming. That particular Saturday in July, I'd driven up there with a group of friends from college. We'd claimed a spot on the eastern shore where the water was deepest, maybe 12 feet down in the middle. The plan was simple. Swim, eat the lunch we'd packed, maybe play some volleyball in the shallow end, and head home before dark. The morning went exactly as planned. We'd been swimming for about 2 hours, taking turns diving off the wooden dock and racing each other across the width of the lake. The water was perfect, not too cold, but refreshing enough to escape the heat. I felt completely relaxed and confident in my swimming abilities. Around noon, I decided to swim out to the center of the lake by myself. I wanted to float on my back and just enjoy the sunshine for a few minutes, away from all the noise and splashing. My friends were busy setting up lunch on the shore, and I told them I'd be back in about 15 minutes. I swam out to what I thought was the deepest part of the lake, probably about 100 yards from shore. The water was so clear that I could see all the way to the bottom, which was covered in a thick layer of fallen branches and leaves that had accumulated over the years. It looked like an underwater forest down there, peaceful and undisturbed. I flipped onto my back and started floating, using gentle kicks to keep myself in position. The sun felt amazing on my face, and I could hear the distant sounds of other swimmers and families enjoying their day. Everything was perfect until I decided to tread water and look around. That's when I felt something brush against my left leg. At first, I thought it might be a fish or some floating debris, so I didn't panic. But when I kicked to move away from whatever it was, I felt resistance. Something was wrapped around my ankle, and it wasn't letting go. I looked down through the clear water and saw that my leg was tangled in what looked like fishing line, or maybe some kind of rope that was attached to the submerged branches below. The more I moved, the tighter it seemed to get. I tried to stay calm and reach down to untangle myself, but the line was wound around my ankles several times, and it was too tight to slip off. Every time I tried to dive down to get a better look, the line would pull me back up before I could reach it with my hands. That's when I started to panic. I was a strong swimmer, but treading water while trying to free myself was exhausting. I called out to my friends on the shore, but they were too far away to hear me clearly. To them, I probably just looked like I was waving hello. The fishing line was cutting into my ankle now, and I could feel it getting tighter with each movement. I tried floating on my back again to conserve energy, but the line kept pulling my leg downward, making it impossible to maintain a good position. I started to realize how serious this situation was becoming. I was trapped in the middle of a lake with no way to free myself, and my friends had no idea I was in trouble. The more tired I became, the harder it was to keep my head above water. I tried everything I could think of. I attempted to dive down and bite through the line with my teeth, but I couldn't hold my breath long enough to reach it. I tried twisting my ankle to loosen the line, but that only made it worse. I even tried to slip my foot out of my water shoe, but the line had tightened around my bare skin. After what felt like 20 minutes, but was probably closer to 10, I was becoming genuinely exhausted. My leg muscles were cramping from the awkward position, and I was having trouble catching my breath between waves. The panic was making everything worse because I couldn't think clearly. That's when I saw my friend Marcus looking in my direction from the shore. He must have noticed that I'd been in the same spot for too long, because he started walking to the edge of the water. I waved both arms above my head and shouted as loud as I could that I needed help. Marcus immediately dove into the lake and started swimming toward me. He was a much stronger swimmer than I was, and he covered the distance quickly. When he reached me, I was barely able to keep my head above water. I explained what was happening, and Marcus took a deep breath and dove down to examine the fishing line. When he came back up, he told me it was wrapped around a large branch that was anchored to the lake bottom. The line had somehow formed a noose-like loop that had caught my ankle. Marcus had a small pocket knife on his keychain, which he'd left in his shorts on the shore. He swam back to get it while I struggled to stay afloat. By the time he returned, I was swallowing water with every breath and could barely move my arms. It took Marcus 3 dives to cut through the fishing line completely. Each time he went under, I sank a little lower in the water. On his final dive, I actually went completely underwater for several seconds before he freed me and pulled me back to the surface. The swim back to shore was a blur. Marcus basically towed me most of the way, while I floated on my back, too exhausted to do much more than kick weakly. When we finally reached shallow water where I could stand, I collapsed onto the sandy bottom and just lay there breathing heavily. My ankle was badly cut from the fishing line, and I had several bruises where the rope had dug into my skin, but I was alive, and that was all that mattered. Marcus later told me that when he first dove down, he could see that the line was wrapped around my ankle at least 4 times, and it had tightened so much that it was cutting off circulation. The scariest part of the whole experience was how quickly it went from a relaxing swim to a life-threatening situation. There were no warning signs, no dangerous conditions, nothing that would have made me think twice about swimming out there. It was just bad luck that I happened to kick my leg into that loop of fishing line at exactly the wrong angle. We reported the incident to the lake authorities, and they sent divers down to remove the debris from that area. They found dozens of pieces of old fishing equipment, discarded rope, and even some barbed wire that had been dumped in the lake over the years. None of it was visible from the surface because it was all tangled up with the natural branches and logs on the bottom. I still swim in lakes and rivers, but I'm much more cautious about swimming alone in unfamiliar areas. I also always tell someone on shore exactly where I'm going and how long I'll be gone. That day taught me that even the safest looking water can hide deadly traps beneath the surface. The most terrifying thing about almost drowning isn't the physical sensation of not being able to breathe. It's the realization that you're completely helpless and that your survival depends entirely on factors beyond your control. If Marcus hadn't noticed me when he did, or if he hadn't had that knife, I would have drowned in 12 feet of crystal clear water while dozens of people enjoyed their day just 100 yards away. This story is absolutely terrifying because it shows how something as innocent as swimming can turn deadly in seconds. The fact that it happened in a place known for being safe makes it even more unsettling. Hidden debris in calm water is such a silent killer. No waves, no current, just invisible death traps waiting below. The randomness of stepping into that fishing line noose is what makes this so haunting. It's a perfect reminder that danger doesn't always announce itself with obvious warning signs. Sometimes the most peaceful-looking situations are hiding the deadliest surprises. Next, we have a story that takes us into an operating room where consciousness returned at the worst possible moment. The worst possible moment. I woke up in the middle of surgery when I was supposed to be completely unconscious. The whole experience lasted maybe 30 seconds, but those 30 seconds felt like an eternity and changed how I think about medical procedures forever. I was having what was supposed to be a routine appendectomy. Nothing complicated, nothing risky. The surgeon had told me it would take about an hour, and I'd be home the next day. I'd never had surgery before, so I was nervous. But everyone assured me this was one of the most common procedures they performed. The last thing I remembered before going under was the anesthesiologist telling me to count backward from 10. I think I made it to 7 before everything went black. The next thing I was supposed to remember was waking up in recovery with a sore throat and some pain in my abdomen. But that's not what happened. Instead, I became aware of voices around me while I was still on the operating table. At first, it was just distant murmuring, like hearing people talk in another room. I couldn't understand what they were saying, and I couldn't move or open my eyes. I just existed in this strange state of partial consciousness where I could hear but couldn't respond. Then the voices got clearer, and I started to understand what was being said. Someone was calling out numbers that I now know were my vital signs. Blood pressure, heart rate, oxygen levels. The tone was urgent but controlled, like they were trying to stay professional while dealing with something unexpected. I heard the surgeon say something about bleeding that shouldn't be happening. Then I heard the word pressure repeated several times, followed by requests for different instruments. The beeping of the monitors around me was getting faster and more irregular. That's when I realized something was going wrong with my surgery. I tried to move, tried to speak, tried to do anything to let them know I was awake, but my body wouldn't respond. It was like being trapped inside myself, completely paralyzed but fully aware of everything happening around me. The most terrifying part was hearing the change in everyone's voices. The casual conversation from earlier was gone, replaced by terse, urgent communication. I heard someone say they needed to call for backup, and another voice asking about blood products being available. Then I heard the monitor alarms start going off. The steady beeping that had been in the background suddenly became a rapid, continuous sound that I instinctively knew meant something was very wrong. I could hear people moving around me more quickly, and the surgeon's voice became more strained. Someone said my blood pressure was dropping and my heart rate was becoming erratic. I heard them discussing medications they could give me, and someone mentioned the possibility of needing to transfuse blood. The words cardiac event were spoken, and my mind immediately jumped to the worst case scenarios. I tried desperately to let them know I was conscious, but nothing worked. I couldn't move my fingers, couldn't flutter my eyelids, couldn't make any sound. I was completely trapped inside my own body while listening to medical professionals fight to save my life. The strangest part was that I couldn't feel any physical pain. Whatever was happening to my body, the anesthesia was still blocking the sensation, even though it wasn't keeping me unconscious anymore. I was aware of pressure and movement, but no actual pain. Then I heard the surgeon say something that made my blood run cold. He told someone to prepare for the possibility that they might not be able to stabilize me. He used medical terminology that I didn't fully understand, but the tone made it clear that my situation had become critical. I heard rapid footsteps as more people entered the operating room. New voices joined the conversation, discussing options and procedures I'd never heard of. Someone mentioned calling my emergency contact, and I realized they were preparing for the possibility that I might not survive. The monitor alarms were constant now, and I could hear someone performing what sounded like chest compressions. The rhythm was steady and forceful, and I realized my heart must have stopped beating properly. This was actually happening. I was dying on the operating table. Just as suddenly as I'd become aware, everything started fading again. The voices became distant, and the urgency in the room seemed to decrease. The last thing I remember hearing was someone saying my vitals were stabilizing, and that whatever they'd done was working. When I woke up in recovery several hours later, I felt like I'd lived through a nightmare. The nurse checking on me seemed surprised that I was awake and alert so quickly after what she called complications during surgery. I asked her what had happened, but she just said the doctor would explain everything. When the surgeon came to see me the next morning, he sat down with a serious expression and told me that I'd experienced what he called an unexpected cardiac event during the procedure. He explained that my heart had become unstable for reasons they couldn't immediately identify, and they'd had to work quickly to get it back into normal rhythm. I told him about waking up and hearing everything that was happening. His face went pale, and he asked me to repeat exactly what I remembered. When I described the conversations I'd overheard and the timeline of events, he was quiet for a long moment. Finally, he told me something that still gives me chills. He said that if my heart had stayed unstable for another 10 or 15 seconds, they wouldn't have been able to get it back. The medications they'd given me had worked just in time, but it had been what he called touch and go for several minutes. He also explained that awareness during surgery, while rare, does happen sometimes. Usually patients don't remember it afterward, but in my case, the combination of the cardiac event and my body's reaction to the emergency medications had created a perfect storm where I remained partially conscious. The scariest part of his explanation was learning how close I'd come to not making it. He showed me my chart from that day, and I could see the dramatic drops in my vital signs, followed by the gradual improvement once they'd stabilized my heart. The gap between life and death had been measured in seconds. I spent an extra 2 days in the hospital for observation, and they ran every cardiac test imaginable to figure out why my heart had reacted that way to the anesthesia. They never found a definitive cause. Sometimes, the cardiologist told me, these things just happen without any warning or underlying condition. The appendectomy itself had been successful, but the experience of almost dying during what should have been routine surgery changed my perspective on medical procedures forever. I've had to have minor surgeries since then, and each time I make sure to have very detailed conversations with the anesthesiologist about what happened. What haunts me most is the knowledge that I was conscious and aware while my life hung in the balance. If I'd stayed awake just a few more seconds, I would have heard them call the time of death. Instead, I heard them save my life, and I'll never forget the relief in their voices when my heart started beating normally again. That experience is absolutely bone-chilling because it combines two of our deepest fears, being trapped and helpless while aware that you're dying. The fact that the poster could hear everything but couldn't communicate is pure nightmare fuel. What makes it even more terrifying is how routine the surgery was supposed to be. Sometimes your body just decides to betray you at the worst possible moment. The 10-second margin between life and death shows just how fragile we really are. I can't imagine ever feeling completely comfortable going under anesthesia again after something like that. Our next story involves a simple wrong turn that nearly ended with a head-on collision at highway speeds. I took the wrong exit and almost drove straight into oncoming traffic at 70 miles per hour. It was one of those construction zones where they'd completely reconfigured the highway, and what should have been a familiar route home turned into a death trap in about 3 seconds. I was driving back from visiting my sister in the next state over. It was a route I'd taken dozens of times, but they'd been doing major construction on that stretch of interstate for months. Usually, I was pretty good about paying attention to the temporary signs and lane changes, but I'd been driving for about 4 hours straight and was getting tired. The construction had been going on so long that they'd actually shifted some of the exits to different locations. Signs were everywhere, warning drivers about the changes, but they were confusing even when you were paying close attention. Some of the temporary signs contradicted the permanent ones that were still up, and the lane markings had been painted over and repainted so many times that it was hard to tell which ones were current. I was getting close to my exit when I saw what I thought was the right sign. It looked like my usual turnoff, and the exit number seemed correct from what I could see. I was in the right lane already, so I followed the curve of what appeared to be the off-ramp, but something felt wrong almost immediately. The road was angled differently than I remembered, and there weren't any of the usual landmarks I was used to seeing. The curve was sharper than normal, and instead of the gradual descent I was expecting, the road seemed to be staying at the same elevation as the highway. I was still trying to figure out what was different when I came around a bend and saw something that made my heart stop. There were headlights coming straight at me, and they were getting bigger fast. I was somehow driving directly into oncoming traffic on what I thought was an exit ramp. The other car was maybe 200 yards away when I first saw it. But at highway speeds, that distance disappears incredibly quickly. I could see that it was a pickup truck, and I could even make out that there were 2 people in the front seat. They were probably having a normal conversation about their day, completely unaware that someone was about to hit them head on. I had maybe 3 seconds to react. My first instinct was to slam on the brakes, but but I realized that would just ensure a collision, since the other vehicle was still approaching at full speed. Instead, I yanked the steering wheel to the right as hard as I could and floored the accelerator to try to get out of their path. The physics of what happened next probably saved both our lives. My car skidded sideways as I pulled the wheel over, and the momentum carried me toward what turned out to be a narrow shoulder area between the road and a concrete barrier. I could hear my tires screaming against the asphalt as I fought to maintain control. The pickup truck flew past me with maybe 2 feet to spare. I caught a glimpse of the driver's face through his passenger window, and he looked just as shocked and terrified as I felt. His horn was blaring, and I could see him struggling to keep his vehicle stable after swerving to avoid me. I ended up sliding sideways into the concrete barrier with a sickening crunch of metal and glass. My airbag deployed, filling the car with that choking powder they use, and for a moment I couldn't see or breathe properly. But I was alive, and more importantly, I hadn't killed anyone else. When the dust settled and I could think clearly again, I realized what had happened. Construction had completely rerouted the exit I was trying to take. What used to be the off-ramp was now a section of oncoming traffic for the reconfigured highway. The signs I'd followed were old ones that hadn't been removed yet, and they'd led me directly into the path of cars travelling in the opposite direction. The pickup truck had pulled over about a quarter-mile down the road, and I could see the driver walking back toward me. He turned out to be a middle-aged man who worked construction himself, and he was surprisingly calm considering we'd just barely avoided a head-on collision that would have killed us both. He helped me out of my car and made sure I wasn't seriously injured before calling 911. While we waited for the police and a tow truck, he explained that this was the third near miss he'd seen at this particular spot in the past month. The construction company kept saying they were going to fix the confusing signage, but apparently they hadn't gotten around to it yet. When the state trooper arrived, he wasn't at all surprised by what had happened. He said they'd been getting reports about this intersection since the construction started, and there had already been 2 serious accidents in the same spot. He was actually relieved that this time it was just property damage and no injuries. The trooper walked me through the maze of construction signs and showed me how easy it was to make the mistake I'd made. The old exit signs were still visible, and the new temporary signs were placed in locations that didn't make intuitive sense. He said he'd driven this route himself just the week before and had almost made the same wrong turn. The car was totaled, but that seemed like a small price to pay, considering the alternative. The insurance adjuster who handled my claim told me later that head-on collisions at highway speeds have a fatality rate of over 90%. The fact that both vehicles were able to swerve just enough to avoid direct impact had saved 4 lives that day. What bothers me most about the whole experience is how easily it could happen to anyone. I wasn't texting or distracted or impaired anymore. I was just a tired driver trying to follow confusing signs in a construction zone. The margin for error was basically 0, and luck was the only thing that prevented a tragedy. The construction company did finally fix the signage about a week after my accident, but only after the local news station did a story about the safety hazards in that area. By then, there had been 5 reported near misses and 3 actual collisions, all involving drivers who made the same mistake I did. I still drive that route sometimes, and the permanent signs are much clearer now. But every time I pass through that area, I think about those 3 seconds when I was staring at oncoming headlights and realizing I was probably about to die. The randomness of survival in that moment came down to reflexes, physics, and pure chance. The scariest part about almost driving into oncoming traffic is how normal everything feels, right up until the moment you see those headlights rushing toward you. No warning bells, no gradual realization, just sudden, immediate terror. Construction zones are already dangerous enough, without misleading signs creating death traps. The fact that multiple people made the same mistake shows this wasn't driver error, but a systemic safety failure. Those 3 seconds of reaction time literally made the difference between going home to family and becoming a highway statistic. I'd probably never trust construction zone signage again after something like that. Let's continue with a story about someone who was saved by the quick thinking of a complete stranger on a crowded platform. I was saved by a stranger who I never got to thank. It happened on a busy subway platform during morning rush hour, and I still think about that person every single day. I was running late for an important job interview downtown. I'd been unemployed for 3 months, and this position was exactly what I'd been hoping for. The interview was scheduled for 9 a.m, and it was already 8:30 when I rushed down the stairs to the platform. The subway station was packed with commuters, everyone trying to get to work on time. People were standing shoulder to shoulder, and the platform was so crowded that you could barely move. I squeezed my way toward what I thought was a good spot to wait for the next train. I I was checking my phone, reviewing my notes for the interview one last time, when I heard the rumble of an approaching train in the distance. The sound echoed through the tunnel, getting louder as it got closer. I could feel the familiar rush of air that always comes before the train arrives at the station. I was so focused on my phone that I wasn't really paying attention to where I was standing. The crowd behind me was pressing forward, and I took a step to maintain my balance. Then another step. I was absorbed in reading through my prepared answers to common interview questions. The train was approaching fast now, and I could see the headlights growing brighter in the tunnel. The sound was getting louder, and I could feel the vibration through the platform beneath my feet. Everyone around me was getting ready to board as soon as the doors opened. That's when I felt someone grab the back of my backpack and yank me backward with tremendous force. I stumbled and nearly fell as whoever it was pulled me away from where I'd been standing. My phone went flying and skidded across the platform. The train roared past the exact spot where I'd been standing just seconds before. It was moving fast, much faster than I'd realized from the sound alone. If I'd still been there when it passed, I would have been struck instantly. I turned around to see who had pulled me back, but the platform was chaos. People were pushing forward to board the train, others were getting off, and in the confusion of bodies moving in every direction, I couldn't identify who had grabbed me. Whoever it was had already disappeared into the crowd. An elderly woman standing nearby looked at me with wide eyes and said, "Son, you were about to step right into that train." She pointed to where I'd been standing, and I could see the yellow safety line on the platform. I'd been standing well beyond it, right at the edge where the train would pass. I gathered up my phone and tried to process what had just happened. Someone had been paying attention when I wasn't. They'd seen me drift too close to the edge and had reacted quickly enough to save my life. If they'd hesitated even for a second, or if they hadn't noticed at all, I would have been killed instantly. The next train arrived a few minutes later, and I rode it downtown in a daze. I kept looking around the corner, wondering if my rescuer was on the same train. I had no way of knowing who it had been. The platform had been too small, and everything had happened too fast. I made it to my interview on time, but I was so shaken that I could barely concentrate on the questions. Every time I tried to focus on what the interviewer was saying, I kept thinking of those few seconds on the platform and how close I'd come to dying. I didn't get the job, but that seemed completely unimportant compared to what had happened that morning. I was alive because a stranger had been paying attention when I wasn't. Someone I'd never met had saved my life, and then vanished back into the crowd without saying a word. For weeks afterward, I found myself studying the faces of people on that same subway platform, hoping to recognize the person who pulled me back. I wanted to thank them, to let them know how much that split-second action had meant, but I never found them. The incident completely changed how I behave around trains and busy platforms. I always stand well back from the edge now, and I never look at my phone while I'm waiting. I also pay attention to other people around me, especially tourists or distracted commuters who might not realize how close they're getting to danger. Sometimes I wonder if that person even remembers pulling me back. Maybe it was just instinct for them, a quick reaction to an obvious danger. They might have gone on with their day without thinking twice about it. But for me, that moment defined the difference between living and dying. What haunts me most is the randomness of it all. If that stranger hadn't been standing in exactly the right place at exactly the right time, or if they'd been distracted by their own phone or thoughts, I would have stepped directly into the path of that train. My survival depended entirely on the awareness and quick reflexes of someone I'll never be able to identify. The fact that a complete stranger saved the poster's life and disappeared into the crowd is both beautiful and haunting. That unknown hero was probably just operating on pure instinct, seeing danger and reacting without thinking. The randomness of having someone notice when you're not paying attention is what makes these moments so profound. It's terrifying how easily we can drift into danger when we're distracted. That split second of awareness from a stranger literally made the difference between life and death. The poster will probably spend the rest of their life looking for that face in crowds. Next, we have someone who woke up to find their tent filling with deadly smoke while camping alone in the wilderness. I woke up choking on smoke, with flames already spreading through my campsite. What was supposed to be a peaceful solo camping trip in the mountains turned into a fight for survival in the middle of the night. I'd been planning this trip for months. It was my first time camping completely alone, and I'd chosen a remote spot about 6 miles from the nearest road. The location was perfect, tucked into a clearing surrounded by pine trees, with a small stream running nearby. I'd set up my tent, made dinner on my portable camping stove, and settled in for what I thought would be a restful night under the stars. The evening had gone exactly as planned. I'd cooked a simple meal, cleaned up properly, and made sure my campfire was completely extinguished before going to bed. I was always careful about fire safety when camping, especially in an area that had been dealing with dry conditions all summer. I placed my camping stove on a flat rock about 10 feet from my tent, and after dinner, I turned it off and disconnected the fuel canister just like I always did. Everything seemed secure and safe when I crawled into my sleeping bag around 10 p.m. I have no idea what time it was when I woke up coughing. At first, I thought I was having some kind of allergic reaction, or maybe coming down with a cold. But as I became more alert, I realized the air inside my tent was thick with smoke, and I could hear a crackling sound that definitely wasn't normal forest noise. I unzipped my tent and stuck my head outside, and what I saw made my blood run cold. The camping stove had somehow tipped over during the night, and the fuel that had leaked out was burning in a growing circle around the base of the rock. The flames had already spread to the dry grass and pine needles nearby, and they were moving toward my tent. I scrambled out of my sleeping bag and crawled outside, but the smoke was so thick that I could barely see. My eyes were watering, and I was coughing so hard that I could barely catch my breath. The fire was spreading faster than I'd thought possible, and I realized I had only minutes before it reached my tent and all my gear. I tried to stamp out the flames closest to my tent, but the fire was already too big and too hot to approach safely. The dry conditions had turned every piece of vegetation into perfect kindling, and the flames were jumping from one patch of grass to another faster than I could react. My first thought was to grab my backpack with my emergency supplies, but when I turned back to my tent, I could see that the flames had already reached the guy lines. The nylon was starting to melt, and I knew the whole thing would go up in seconds. I managed to grab my water bottles and my cell phone before the tent became completely engulfed. I dumped the water on the flames closest to me, but it was like trying to stop an avalanche with a teaspoon. The fire was spreading in all directions now, and I was trapped in the middle of it. The smoke was getting thicker, and I was having trouble breathing. Every breath felt like inhaling sandpaper, and my throat was burning. I could hear the fire crackling louder as it reached the trees, and I realized this was about to become much more than just a campfire accident. I started running toward the stream, hoping the water would provide some protection from the fire. But the smoke was so dense that I could barely see where I was going, and I kept stumbling over rocks and fallen branches. The forest that had seemed so peaceful earlier was now a maze of obstacles in the dark. When I finally reached the stream, I splashed water on my face and tried to clear my lungs, but I could see that the fire was still spreading behind me. The flames were reaching the lower branches of the pine trees, and I knew that once they got into the canopy, the whole forest could go up. I had no choice but to follow the stream away from the fire. I waded through the cold water, using it as a fire break while I tried to get far enough away to be safe. My bare feet were getting cut in the rocks, and I was soaked and shivering, but at least I could breathe again. I followed the stream for what felt like hours before I felt safe enough to stop. When I finally climbed out of the water and looked back, I could see an orange glow through the trees that showed the fire was still burning. I had no idea how far it had spread or whether it would reach other campsites in the area. My cell phone had no signal, so I couldn't call for help. I was 6 miles from the nearest road, wearing only the clothes I'd slept in, with no supplies except a half-empty water bottle. I spent the rest of the night huddled under a tree, shivering and waiting for dawn so I could find my way. When the sun came up, I could see smoke rising from multiple spots in the forest. The fire had definitely spread beyond my campsite, and I could hear the distant sound of helicopters, which meant the Forest Service was already responding to the blaze. It took me most of the day to hike out to the parking area where I'd left my car. By the time I reached the trailhead, there were fire trucks and emergency vehicles everywhere. I was immediately taken to a medical station where they checked me for smoke inhalation and treated the cuts on my feet. The fire investigator who interviewed me said the camping stove had probably been knocked over by a small animal looking for food scraps. Even though I'd cleaned up properly, the smell of cooking had attracted something during the night. And when it knocked the stove over, the residual fuel in the lines had ignited. The fire ended up burning over 300 acres before they got it under control. No one else was hurt, but several other campsites were destroyed, and the entire area was closed for the rest of the summer. If I'd slept through the smoke for even a few more minutes, I would have been trapped in my tent when the flames reached it. What terrifies me most about that night is how quickly everything went from peaceful to life-threatening. One moment I was sleeping soundly in what I thought was a safe campsite, and the next moment I was running for my life through a forest fire. The margin between safety and disaster was measured in minutes. I still go camping, but I'm much more careful about where I place my equipment and how I secure it at night. I also carry a smoke detector in my tent now, which might sound paranoid, but that night taught me that disaster can strike even when you think you've done everything right. This story is absolutely terrifying because it shows how quickly nature can turn against you when you're completely alone. The idea of waking up surrounded by flames with no escape route is pure nightmare fuel. What makes it even scarier is that the poster did everything right, properly extinguishing the campfire, placing the stove safely away from the tent, cleaning up food scraps. Sometimes random wildlife encounters can create deadly chain reactions that no amount of preparation can prevent. The fact that this turned into a 300-acre forest fire shows just how catastrophic that single knocked-over stove became. Solo camping will never feel the same after reading something like that. Our next story comes from someone who received shocking news from a doctor about what should have been a fatal medical emergency. I received shocking news that should have killed me when the paramedics found my body completely unresponsive. What started as a normal Tuesday evening turned into a medical mystery the doctors still can't fully explain. I've been feeling fine all day, maybe a little tired, but nothing that seemed unusual or concerning. I'd worked my normal shift at the office, grabbed dinner on the way home, and settled in to watch some TV before bed. Everything was completely routine until it wasn't. I remember sitting on my couch around 8 p.m, scrolling through channels and feeling like I might fall asleep early. I was unusually drowsy for that time of evening, but I figured it had just been a long day. I decided to close my eyes for a few minutes before getting ready for bed. The next thing I knew, I was waking up in a hospital room with tubes down my throat and machines beeping all around me. There were people in scrubs hovering over me, checking monitors and writing things down on charts. The lights were blindingly bright, and I couldn't understand why I was there or how much time had passed. When I tried to sit up, a nurse gently pushed me back down and told me to stay calm. She explained that I was in the intensive care unit and had been unconscious for over 18 hours. I tried to ask what had happened, but I couldn't speak with the breathing tube in my throat. My neighbor had found me. She'd been expecting me to take in a package for her while she was at work, and when I didn't answer my door, she'd used the spare key I'd given her for emergencies. She found me collapsed on my living room floor, completely unresponsive with no pulse that she could detect. The paramedics who responded to her 911 call told me later that my vital signs were so weak they almost didn't register on their equipment. My body temperature had dropped to dangerous levels. My blood pressure was barely measurable. My heart was beating so slowly and irregularly that they weren't sure I was still alive. They worked on me for almost 20 minutes before they could get a stable pulse. Even then, my condition was so critical that they called ahead to the hospital to prepare for the worst-case scenario. The emergency room doctor who received me said he'd never seen someone survive the kind of systemic shutdown my body had experienced. For the first 48 hours, nobody could figure out what had caused my collapse. They ran every test imaginable, looking for heart problems, brain issues, poisoning, allergic reactions, infections, and dozens of other possibilities. All the results came back normal or inconclusive. The breakthrough came when a specialist noticed some unusual patterns in my blood work that suggested my body had gone into a kind of protective hibernation state. My metabolism had slowed down so dramatically that I'd essentially entered a temporary coma to preserve my vital organs. But they still couldn't identify what had triggered this response. I had no underlying health conditions, no family history of similar episodes, and no exposure to toxins or medications that might cause such a reaction. It was like my body had just decided to shut down for no apparent reason. The most unsettling part was what the cardiologist told me on my third day in the hospital. He said that based on my vital signs when the paramedics found me, I should have been dead for at least an hour before they arrived. The combination of my heart rate, blood pressure, and body temperature was incompatible with consciousness or survival. He showed me the printout from the paramedics' equipment, and I could see the flat lines where my vital signs barely registered. He pointed to specific numbers and explained that they represented a level of systemic failure that the human body doesn't typically recover from. Yet somehow, I'd recovered. Not only was I alive, but within a week, all my vital signs had returned to completely normal ranges. The brain scans showed no damage from oxygen deprivation, and my heart function was perfect. It was like the episode had never happened, except for the medical records proving it had. The doctors kept me for observation for another 5 days, running the same tests over and over, hoping to find some explanation for what had occurred. They consulted with specialists from other hospitals and even sent my blood samples to research labs. But nobody could provide a definitive answer. When they finally discharged me, the lead physician sat me down for what he called the most unusual conversation of his career. He told me that in 30 years of emergency medicine, he'd never seen someone survive what I'd survived. The fact that I'd made a complete recovery with no lasting effects was, in his words, medically impossible. He gave me a list of warning signs to watch for and instructions to seek immediate medical attention if I ever felt anything similar to what I'd experienced that night. But he also admitted that since they didn't know what had caused the episode in the first place, they had no idea how to prevent it from happening again. The whole experience lasted less than a week from collapse to discharge, but it completely changed how I think about the fragility of life. I went from feeling perfectly healthy to being declared medically dead to making a full recovery with no explanation for any of it. What haunts me most is the randomness of survival. If my neighbor hadn't been expecting that package, if she hadn't had my spare key, if she decided to wait until the next day to check on me, I would have died alone on my living room floor. My survival depended entirely on a coincidence and the quick thinking of someone who happened to care enough to investigate when I didn't answer my door. I still live in the same apartment, and I still see my neighbor regularly. She never makes a big deal about what happened, but sometimes I catch her looking at me with this expression that suggests she's still processing the fact that she found me dead, and I'm somehow standing there talking to her. The doctors never did figure out what caused my body to shut down that night. They've labeled it an idiopathic event, which is medical terminology for we have no idea what happened. I've had follow-up appointments and additional testing, but everything continues to come back normal. Sometimes I wonder if I actually did die that night and somehow came back. The timeline certainly suggests that's what happened, even though it sounds impossible. Paramedics, the doctors, and all the medical equipment agreed that my body had shut down beyond the point of recovery. But here I am, telling this story, with no lasting effects except for the knowledge that life can end without warning. And sometimes, for reasons nobody understands, it can begin again just as mysteriously. This story is absolutely mind-bending because it challenges everything we think we know about life and death. The fact that multiple medical professionals confirmed the poster should have been dead, yet they made a complete recovery with zero explanation, is both miraculous and terrifying. Medical mysteries like this remind us how much we still don't understand about the human body. The timing of the neighbor's intervention was the only thing standing between life and death. Sometimes survival truly defies all logic and scientific understanding. The randomness of both the collapse and the rescue shows how thin the line between existence and oblivion really is. Now let's turn to a story about someone who missed a deadly accident by making one small last-minute decision. I was almost in a car that got hit by a drunk driver, but I switched rides at the last minute because I forgot something at home. That split-second decision to go back for my phone charger saved my life and haunted me with survivor's guilt for years afterward. It was a Friday night, and my friends and I were heading to a party across town. We'd all been looking forward to it for weeks, and everyone was in great spirits as we got ready to leave. The plan was simple. My friend Jake would drive his sedan, and 4 of us would pile in to head over together. I was already in the back seat when I realized I'd left my phone charger plugged into the wall in my bedroom. My phone was almost dead, and I knew I'd need it to call for rides later or to coordinate with other friends at the party. It seemed like a minor inconvenience, but I didn't want to be stuck with no way to communicate. I told Jake I'd be right back and ran inside to grab the charger. It should have taken 30 seconds, but as I was unplugging it, I got a text from my roommate asking me to lock the back door before I left. I'd forgotten about that completely, so I had to go check the door and make sure the deadbolt was engaged. When I came back outside, Jake and the others were getting impatient. They'd been sitting in the car for about 3 minutes, and Jake was worried we'd hit traffic if we waited much longer. The party was starting at 8, and it was already 7:30. But my other friend Marcus had just pulled into the driveway in his truck. He'd originally planned to meet us at the party, but when he saw us getting ready to leave, he offered to give me a ride instead. This would let Jake's cars be less crowded, and Marcus and I could catch up during the drive. I made a quick decision to ride with Marcus instead. I grabbed my jacket from Jake's back seat and switched vehicles. Jake seemed relieved to have more space, and Marcus was happy to have company for the drive. We all planned to meet up at the party in about 20 minutes. Marcus and I left first since his truck was blocking the driveway. As we pulled out of the neighborhood, I could see Jake's car in the rearview mirror, following about a block behind us. We were taking the same route, so I figured we'd probably end up arriving at roughly the same time. The drive started normally. Marcus and I were talking about work and catching up on things that had happened since we'd last hung out. The roads were busy, but not unusually so for a Friday night. Traffic was moving smoothly, and we were making good time toward our destination. We were about 15 minutes into the drive when Marcus got a call on his hands-free system. It was his girlfriend, and she sounded upset about something that had happened at work. He pulled over into a gas station parking lot so he could give her his full attention without being distracted while driving. I sat in the passenger seat, scrolling through my phone, while Marcus talked through whatever crisis his girlfriend was dealing with. The conversation went on for about 10 minutes, and I could see Jake's car pass by on the main road. They were probably going to beat us to the party at this point. When Marcus finally finished the call, we got back on the road and continued toward our destination. The traffic had gotten heavier, and we hit a red light that seemed to last forever. I remember feeling slightly annoyed that we were running late, but Marcus assured me the party would go until at least midnight, so missing the first half hour wasn't a big deal. We were stopped at that red light when we heard the sirens. Multiple emergency vehicles were racing past us in the opposite direction, heading back toward the area we'd just come from. There were police cars, fire trucks, and at least 2 ambulances, all moving with urgent purpose through the night. Marcus and I looked at each other with concern. That many emergency vehicles usually meant something serious had happened. We both hoped it wasn't anything involving people we knew, but we didn't think much more about it as the light turned green and we continued toward the party. When we arrived at the party, around 8:15, I immediately started looking for Jake and the others. I figured they'd beaten us there and were probably already inside enjoying themselves. But after searching through the crowded house for several minutes, I couldn't find any of them anywhere. I tried calling Jake's phone, but it went straight to voicemail. Same thing with the other 2 friends who'd been in his car. I figured maybe they'd gotten stuck in traffic or had stopped somewhere else first. It wasn't unusual for plans to change at the last minute. But as the evening wore on and none of them showed up or returned my calls, I started to get worried. These weren't the type of friends who would just disappear without letting anyone know where they were. Something felt wrong. Around 10 p.m, I got a call that changed everything. It was Jake's sister, and she was calling from the hospital. There had been an accident. A drunk driver had run a red light and slammed into Jake's car at over 60 miles per hour. The impact had been devastating. My 3 friends were all in critical condition. Jake had multiple broken bones and internal bleeding. One of the passengers was in a coma. The 3rd friend had been airlifted to a trauma center with life-threatening injuries. The drunk driver had walked away from his truck without a scratch. I felt sick to my stomach as the reality of what had happened sank in. If I hadn't gone back for my phone charger, if I hadn't switched cars at the last minute, I would have been in that back seat when the drunk driver hit them. The seat I'd originally been sitting in had taken the brunt of the impact on the passenger side. Marcus drove me to the hospital immediately, and we spent the entire night in the waiting room with our friends' families. The doctors worked for hours to stabilize everyone, and it was touch and go for several days. 2 of my friends required multiple surgeries, and their recovery took months of physical therapy and rehabilitation. The guilt I felt was overwhelming. While my friends were fighting for their lives, I was completely unharmed because of a forgotten phone charger. I kept thinking about how random and arbitrary survival could be. A 30-second delay had been the difference between life and potential death. I visited my friends in the hospital every day during their recovery. They never made me feel guilty about not being in the car, but I could see in their eyes that they were processing their own trauma from the accident. We were all changed by what had happened that night. The drunk driver was eventually sentenced to 15 years in prison. He'd had 3 previous DUI convictions and had been driving with a suspended license. He'd made a choice that night that destroyed multiple lives and families, all because he was too selfish to call for a ride. All 3 of my friends eventually made full recoveries, though it took the better part of a year. We're all still close, but there's an unspoken understanding between us about how fragile life really is. That night taught us that survival often comes down to timing, luck, and random decisions that seem insignificant at the moment. I still have that phone charger. It sits in my nightstand drawer, and sometimes I look at it and think about how something so mundane saved my life. If I'd been more organized, if I'd remembered to pack it earlier, if I decided my phone battery was good enough to last the evening, I would have been in that car when it was hit. The randomness of survival is what haunts me most about that night. There was no grand plan, no divine intervention, just a forgotten piece of electronics that changed the trajectory of my entire life. Sometimes the smallest decisions have the biggest consequences, and you never know which moments will define everything that comes after. This story perfectly encapsulates how survivor's guilt can be just as devastating as the trauma itself. The fact that something as simple as a phone charger determined who lived and who almost died shows how arbitrary survival can be. What makes this even more heartbreaking is that the poster has to live with the knowledge that they should have been in that car. The randomness of timing in life or death situations is what makes these experiences so haunting. Sometimes the most insignificant decisions end up being the most important ones you'll ever make. That phone charger represents both salvation and the weight of surviving when others didn't. If you enjoyed this batch of stories, be sure to subscribe for more. Thank you for sticking around, and as always, sweet dreams.